Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Monday, February 24th, day 507 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic reporter, Laser Berman, from our Jerusalem office. Hi, Laser. Thanks for joining me today in this semi-snowy weather.
Good morning. There's a couple of flakes, but it's really not what I was hoping for.
No one was hoping for a couple of flakes, for sure. So as Israel currently continues its pause in releasing some 600 Palestinian security prisoners, Laser will update us on the status of negotiations to either prolong the first phase of the hostage release ceasefire deal or reach a second phase. We'll also hear about an enlarged IDF operation in the West Bank that, as of yesterday, includes tanks. Yesterday was also the funeral for the former leader of Hezbollah and his successor, whom Israel killed in airstrikes 5 months ago. We'll learn about Israel's messaging during the event. Also yesterday, Germany held elections and the far-right AfD party won a historical second place. What does this mean? And today marks the 3-year anniversary of the current war in Ukraine, and we'll hear about recent statements from President Zelensky. All this and much, much more when we're back. Laser, the White House says that it supports Israel's decision to delay releasing 600 Palestinian prisoners, citing the, quote, barbaric treatment of Israeli hostages by Hamas. And at the same time, we're hearing for the first time from U.S. President Donald Trump's Mideast envoy, Steve Witkoff, that he will come to the region again this week to try and negotiate an extension of the first phase of the ceasefire and hostage release deal or start some kind of talks for the second phase. So this week is meant to be the end of the first phase with the handing over of 4 additional bodies by Hamas. But of course, we have a delay in the security prisoner releases. So how do you see this week playing out, first of all, and then let's talk negotiations?
There's no questions we're at a fraught time in the talks. What you're hearing from the United States is that there is a desire to get to a second phase. They want to see this war ended, but they continue to say quite clearly that Hamas must be eliminated. It cannot be allowed to govern the Gaza Strip, and they seem to mean it. You also hear that they are letting Israel lead on policy, saying whatever Israel decides to do, we're going to back them. So there's plenty of people looking for signs of some kind of quiet disagreement or some sort of tension over the move to the second phase, but it doesn't seem to be there. America's active. It's certainly trying to keep things alive. It's trying to get more and more hostages out, but it seems to be quite content with letting Israel make the policy on this. So I don't think there's anything here that really should worry Israel. But of course, Israel has to make some decisions about what it wants to do next. You heard a very, not really aggressive, but a speech in which Netanyahu last night was talking to cadets in the IDF Ground Forces Officers Course. And he said multiple times, he kept going back to the term total victory, and it continued to insist that Israel would not let Hamas continue to exist as a military organization to rule the Gaza Strip, and he was going to get all the hostages out. So really nothing has changed there. And he was quite clear, we can do this through negotiations, we can do it through war. That is the position the Netanyahu government and Netanyahu himself has been saying for months, almost the entire war. So there's really not much change there. There is the attempt, it's certainly in Israel's interest to try to extend the first phase of the deal, because that means more hostages, more living hostages out, without committing to any end of the war. Yeah, and that's certainly something that Israel is pushing for. Hamas, they seem to be, it's hard to understand why. They just don't understand the way their actions are seen in Israel and the world, or they don't care, or they can push Israel to end the war. But their actions are doing everything possible to convince the world and to convince Israelis that are not already convinced that there is no way to allow this organization to exist, that they are, evil distilled, and that there's just no way to come to any lasting agreement with them. The way they handled the release of the bodies of the Bibas kids, the way they didn't give back Sherry Bibas's body. You also have these explosives placed on buses in the West Bank. All those things add up to, this is just not an organization that thinks the way we do. And this is not an organization that Israel or the U.S. can trust to abide by any agreements in the long term if they're allowed to remain in the Gaza Strip.
So it's Hamas's interest to push to the stage 2, which essentially would mean Israel ends the war and Hamas would survive that, it appears at this point. And every time hostages are released, the living hostages, obviously, they come back with the message that Israel must end the war. Israel must take out the hostages. So on the one hand, this staggered, delayed release of all of the living hostages has played exactly into Hamas's hands, because every living hostage who comes back is just a testament to the terrible conditions of those who remain there. And there are currently, I believe, 22 or 24 who Israel believes are still alive. And then Hamas is again restarting the PR machine that it so masterfully controlled during most of this war, in which the protests are putting pressure on the Netanyahu government to cease the war. So don't you think that Hamas has actually played it rather brilliantly?
No, not at all. I think, if anything, more and more Israelis understand that they want to get the hostages out, and they understand that there's going to be no long-term agreement with this group. I mean, if you talk to the public, they're not the ones making policy, and it's one thing to say we want the hostages out, and if you press, do you want Hamas to continue to rule the Gaza Strip, then also most people would not want that, I think. But when you try to square the two together, it just it doesn't work. You want the PA to come in. There's 1,000 reasons why that wouldn't work either. But I think what Israel's government is doing now is an acceptable middle ground, trying to, for now, get as many living hostages out as possible, while maintaining the option of going back to war. We can do this for weeks as long as we continue to get hostages out. The fact that the condition of the hostages puts more urgency in the need to get the rest of the living hostages out, on the one hand, sure, but at the same time, it reminds us who we're dealing with. So I think on balance, it doesn't really change the public debate one way or the other in terms of who has the upper hand.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made a rare visit to the Palestinian city of Tulkarem in the West Bank on Friday, where he said that Israeli forces would step up ongoing counterterrorism operations. And yesterday, Israeli tanks deployed to the West Bank for the first time in over 20 years. And Defense Minister Israel Katz said that he had instructed the IDF to stay for at least the next year in West Bank refugee camps that have been cleared of terror operatives and civilians, and not allow some 40,000 displaced Palestinians to return. There is a lot going on here now in the West Bank. But Laser, I am really curious to hear your thoughts about the use of tanks here, because I know you have a lot of knowledge on the subject and the use of tanks in Israeli warfare in general.
I mean, let's not forget it's only 3 tanks. Right. So it's one platoon of tanks. It's not exactly changing the whole balance. But once you bring in 3 tanks, that means they're ready to bring in more. It depends what we see going forward. I think in any major operation moving forward, we'll continue to see massive use of force. The big escalation we've seen in the past year is that now there are airstrikes, not only carried out by drones, not only by helicopters, but sometimes by fighter jets within the West Bank, which wasn't something seen for a long, long time. So, we see a new determination. I think the fact the tanks is kind of just a symbol or a detail, but what will really matter is whether indeed Israeli forces will stay in these places over the long term. There's certainly nowhere where they can't reach. From the beginning of the effort after October 7th in the West Bank, you had forces going in mass to places where they hadn't been in a long time, to the center of these refugee camps, which are often the hotbed of terrorism. So the focus of Israeli fighting right now is the West Bank. That is where the combat is. The Lebanese front for now is quiet. The Syrian front is quiet. We'll see what happens with Gaza, but for now, there's not combat there. So this is where it is. This is where the focus of Israel's attention is. And as long as these groups try to carry out attacks on Israelis, whether it's in the West Bank, whether it's in the rest of Israel, you're going to see some very, very aggressive operations.
Now that, as you said, Lebanon and Syria are rather quiet, I just wonder, with the increase of readiness on the Gaza border right now, as we learned yesterday night, do we have enough manpower to carry out this long-term, year-long, potentially, operation in the West Bank?
It's a strain. It's certainly a strain, but again, it depends, what kind of operations we have in the north. We've already tripled the size of the force that defends the border compared to before October 7th. It depends what operations we're going to need in Gaza. If the war goes back to a full-scale war in Gaza, you're going to have something like 3-4 divisions operating in Gaza. That will put a strain on the force. But there is enough, if they're used wisely, to carry out aggressive operations in the West Bank. You think what a brigade can do in a refugee camp, that's really plenty. You don't need divisions operating in most of these places. So you can divide forces, you can use smaller forces, but it's going to be a strain, and that is something that we've talked about in the past, especially in what kind of force do we need moving forward. What happens with this chok giyus, with this enlistment of Haredim? That's something that would make all of this much easier and would give security to Israel.
We're going to go to a short break and then discuss what's going on outside of Israel's borders. And we're back. Tens of thousands of black-eyed mourners vowed support for the Hezbollah terror group yesterday at the Beirut funeral of slain leader Hassan Nasrallah after the group was dealt major blows in its last round of hostilities with Israel. As the funeral began in the Sports City Stadium, Lebanon's biggest sports arena, Israeli warplanes flew at a low altitude over Beirut. The crowd in the stadium then chanted, "Death to Israel, death to America. We respond to your call, Nasrallah." And the question is, of course, what was the message that our Defense Minister Israel Katz was trying to convey with this flyover, Laser?
I think there's multiple messages. First of all, that you better be careful because we can reach anywhere and we're not afraid of any reaction from you. Before October 7th, this would have led to some sort of response from Hezbollah, whether it's rocket fire, or something else, but Hezbollah has been so neutered in recent months that we're just not afraid of that at all. We're willing to fly low over a funeral of the people we killed with those planes. That's a powerful symbol. Let's not forget also that there is a fight for power within Lebanon, that the anti-Hezbollah forces, in the form of the president Joseph Aoun, much of the army, and have the upper hand currently. And I think it strengthens them as well. I'm sure they're very happy to see that Israeli planes are flying over. Again, we have to be careful that we're not seen as violating too much of Lebanese sovereignty, and it actually weakens the presidency. But something like that, I think there's really no cost to us. It's a sign, it's a reminder, and there's nothing Hezbollah can do about it for now.
So last night, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had a, quote, warm conversation with Friedrich Merz, who is the presumptive German chancellor after his CDU/CSU party came first in the German elections yesterday. According to Netanyahu's office, Merz said he would invite him to Germany, which seems to indicate that Merz would not enforce the International Criminal Court arrest warrant against Netanyahu, yet to be seen. Now, for his part, Merz has vowed to help give Europe, quote, real independence from the U.S. as he prepares to cobble together a government. But to me, the real story of these elections is the surge in support for the far-right anti-immigration party, AfD, which took a historic second place among the electorate. Laser, what do you have to say about these German elections?
So just on the AfD side, there's a kind of a saying within politics that if the liberals don't enforce the border, then the fascists will. That's a little bit broad term to call someone a fascist here, but if the traditional governments brought in mass immigration against the will of a lot of people, and you're seeing problems because of it, and tensions because of it, and even crime because of it, then guess what? They're going to turn to other parties. And those parties might not be who the establishment likes. So I think they have a lot to blame for their inability to see where their policies would take them. Also there's economic pressures. Some of it is because of energy policies. So I think there's a lot of blame to go around. In terms of the victor himself, in terms of Merz himself, Israel seems very, very happy about this. You had Israel's ambassador to Germany, Ron Prosor, saying on the radio today that he's undoubtedly a friend of Israel. He has blasted the previous government for this quiet weapons ban on Israel. Seems pretty clear that he's not going to enforce ICC arrest warrants against Netanyahu. It's not like they're going to drop out of the court, but they'll find ways, whether it's through new legislation or other ways, to avoid it. So I think this is very good for Israel. Obviously, Germany, a dominant power in Europe, and where it goes, in many ways, the EU goes. So it'll take a while to cobble together a coalition, but this comes at a crucial time for Germany, with the Trump administration putting new pressures on Europe. Europe has to decide how it wants to respond to the new U.S. position and how it wants to respond to Ukraine, whether it can put together a unified and effective response. Obviously, Israel is much less important now. They have more important issues to worry about, and I think that's a good thing for Israel. And I think all in all, Israel comes out well with this new government that's emerging.
What I'm hearing just from international media is that many who voted for AfD are actually quite young. They're among the youth vote. And as you mentioned, it could be a change vote. It could be something to be anti the Olaf Scholz government. But it makes me a little worried personally, as somebody who monitors anti-Semitism around the world and of course, a student of Jewish history, to see that there is such a surge in support for this far-right party, and not only, also for the far-left party, which is also anti-Israel, at least if not arguably anti-Semitic. Do you see any reason to worry right now, or for Israel to worry specifically?
Less so. I think support for Israel and Germany has remained strong over the years, and it looks like it's going to get stronger with this government. There's always reason to worry about anti-Semitism in Europe and in Germany. It exists. It continues to exist. The question is why young people voted for this party. And I think there's a pattern. We also saw, let's say, Donald Trump do very well amongst young people, that what the traditional governments or rulers have offered is not something that the young people feel happy with, that they feel like they can't make it, that other people are getting handouts when when they're playing by the rules, and they want less of their money going abroad. I think all those things come together, and there's also certainly an anti-immigration wave sweeping Europe, sweeping the United States in the wake of the immigration policies after the Syrian civil war. So it's not only in Germany. I think it reflects what's going on in a lot of democratic countries, but yeah, it's something that we do need to keep an eye on. And if indeed other parties and other leaders feel like the AfD is out of the pale, then maybe they should think about the voters that aren't anti-Semites that are voting for them, and how they can offer something to pull those voters away, and to really listen to what is motivating these votes.
So yesterday, Vladimir Zelensky said he was ready to quit as Ukraine's president if it meant Kiev would be admitted to the NATO military alliance. This is on the eve of the third anniversary of Russia's invasion. And Zelensky has faced fierce criticism from the new U.S. administration. And in a series of verbal attacks over the last week, U.S. President Donald Trump has branded Zelensky a quote-unquote dictator, since he has indeed put off elections. Now, listeners, Laser and I took a very deep dive into Ukraine for the Friday Focus that came out just a few days ago. So please check that out. But Laser, I want to hear your thoughts about this statement from Zelensky. Is it authentic or some kind of public relations stunt? Because it was my impression from you on Friday that it's not necessarily in Europe's interest for Ukraine to be admitted to NATO. So what is this messaging here?
It's just not going to happen. Ukraine's not going to go into NATO. I think he's trying to push back on the idea that he's a dictator, that he's not in it for himself, that if the security of Ukraine is guaranteed, certainly going into NATO would be a wonderful guarantee, then he's happy to say that he's done his work and he can retire. So I think that's what the pushback is. You see that I think he's learned his lesson about the initial response, that you don't want to attack Trump directly. He should soften his response. He's not going to gain anything by getting into a verbal war. So the work now is with Europe, trying to establish, a plan moving forward with Europe. European leaders were in Kyiv on the anniversary to offer their support, and to try to figure out what exactly the U.S. is doing to work on reestablishing some sort of trust with them, and to see if they can influence what happens in talks, and see if they can actually get involved in talks that the U.S. is overseeing. So I think he's in a very, very difficult position. Certainly you're seeing the public rally behind him, even political opponents. But I think it's kind of a wait and see. They know they have European support. They have to see what that means and whether they can shift the dial on Trump administration policy.
Laser, thank you so much for this. And listeners, I'm reminding you again that we have this Friday Focus series, this podcast series, which Laser and I began about 2 months ago or so. We've had something like 7 episodes. I'm very bad at math. In any case, please check out our Friday Focus series. It is now on its own channel, so you can subscribe to that on its own. And it is also, in the meantime, at least being relayed through our daily briefing channel on Fridays. Laser, thank you so much for joining me today. We'll meet again on Friday, right?
That's right. See you Friday, Amanda.
See you Friday. Thank you so much for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by Ben Wallach. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.